Her words still echo in my mind, as if the walls themselves whispered them back to me. Her presence makes the house feel heavy. My daughter-in-law thought I was out of earshot when she said it on the phone, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness people use when they don't want to sound cruel but end up cutting deeper than a knife. She didn't know I was sitting on the other side of the hallway, my hands folded tightly on my lap, my breath caught in my throat. I am 75 years old, a black woman who has worked all her life as a seamstress, shaping fabric into beauty when my own world often felt ragged at the edges. My name is Margaret, and today I will share with you a story I never believed I would tell aloud, the story of how love, sacrifice, and blind trust turned into a silence so sharp it nearly swallowed me whole. If you believe that age does not erase our worth, that our voices still matter no matter the lines on our faces, then please stay with me until the end. The house where I now live is nothing like the one I built memories in. My son David and his wife Claire call it a modern retreat. It sits just outside Atlanta. All glass walls and polished steel, a world away from the warm wooden frame house my late husband Samuel and I tended for decades. I used to wake to the smell of fresh cornbread baking in our kitchen, sunlight spilling through curtains I stitched myself, walls that carried laughter and gospel music on Sunday mornings. Now I wake to silence, interrupted only by the hum of a refrigerator that looks like it belongs in a showroom rather than a home. My room is at the far end of their sprawling place, near the garage where the cars gleam like ornaments. They say it's convenient, easier for me not to climb stairs. But deep down, I know what it really means: distance. Distance between their lives and mine, as though I were a shadow they want to keep out of sight. 8 months have passed since Samuel's funeral, and each morning I still reach across the bed for his hand, forgetting it will never be there again. When David told me I shouldn't stay alone in our old house, that it was unsafe for a woman my age to live so far from hospitals and neighbors, I agreed. At first, I thought I was being welcomed into the heart of his family. But slowly, I learned that my place here is not at the center. It is at the edges. Claire decorated my room in soft beige and grays, she called neutral sophistication. To me, it feels like being trapped inside a cloud that never rains. My quilt stitched from scraps of dresses, curtains, and Sunday suits hangs folded at the foot of the bed, looking misplaced against her sleek linen. On my nightstand rests Samuel's old pocket Bible and a photograph of our wedding day. 2 anchors in a sea of unfamiliarity. I try each day to be useful, to prove that I am not a burden. I wake early, long before anyone else, and brew coffee the way Samuel loved it: strong, dark, the kind that warms your bones. But no one in this house drinks it. Claire prefers her frothy machine-made cappuccinos, and David takes energy drinks to the office. I press clothes, wipe down already spotless counters, and water the potted plants Claire arranged only because her interior designer suggested them. Sometimes I hum hymns while I work, just to remind myself I am still alive. The grandchildren Ethan and Maya rush past me in the mornings, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, barely looking up when I whisper, "Good morning, babies." They used to sit on my lap and beg me for stories, but now their eyes slide away quickly, afraid perhaps that acknowledging me might displease their mother. One morning while arranging roses I had cut from the little patch I started behind the garage hidden. Because Claire insisted the plants looked messy near the patio, overheard the words that broke me. Claire was speaking to her sister. "The whole place smells like old things since she moved in. I can't explain it. It's not dirty, it's just her, and it lingers." She laughed lightly, as if making a harmless joke. But to me, it wasn't harmless, it was a sentence. I stood frozen, clutching the roses, thorns pressing into my palm. In that moment, I felt not like a guest, not like family, but like an intruder in my own child's home. That day I carried the roses back to my room, and laid them in a glass jar, my hands trembling as the petals quivered. I stared at them until their red seemed to bleed into the beige walls, and all I could hear was her voice replaying in my head. Her presence makes the house feel heavy. I wondered if Samuel would have known what to say, how he would have defended me, Or maybe he would have simply taken my hand and reminded me that my worth was not determined by another person's comfort. But he wasn't here. I was alone in that house full of people, my silence becoming thicker than the paint on the walls. That night I sat on the edge of the bed with Samuel's pocket Bible in my hands, flipping through the fragile pages until my eyes landed on a verse I had underlined long ago. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. I whispered it out loud like a lifeline, though even as the words left my lips I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down harder. The memories would not let me rest. I thought back to the years I had given everything for David's future. When he was young and dreamed of becoming an architect, Samuel and I worked ourselves ragged to pay for his schooling. I took on extra sewing jobs, hemming uniforms late into the night under the yellow glow of a lamp, my fingers aching until they blistered. Samuel worked overtime at the factory, his body bent and bruised but his spirit steady. We ate beans and cornbread for weeks on end so that David could have the textbooks he needed, the drawing tools he said were essential. When tuition deadlines came and we had no savings left, we mortgaged our house a second time, telling ourselves it was for his future. He'll take care of us when we're old, Samuel always said. I clung to those words like they were a promise written in stone. And in truth, when David graduated, I felt proud beyond measure. I remember the day clearly, the bright Georgia sun, the sea of gowns, and my boy walking across that stage, diploma in hand. He hugged us both and said he would never forget our sacrifices. I believed him then. But not long after, he moved away, got married, built his career, and our phone calls became shorter. Holidays became fewer, and eventually, years passed where I saw more of his life through pictures online than in person. Yet when he called 3 years ago, panic thick in his voice, saying his firm was in trouble, saying that he and Claire might lose the house, I didn't hesitate. Without Samuel to advise me, I walked into the bank alone and withdrew everything I had saved, $38,000. Every penny I had set aside for the quiet years I had imagined with my husband. The banker asked me twice if I was sure. I nodded. Family comes first, I said. That money saved them. Within 2 years, David's firm was thriving again, bigger than ever. They bought new cars, remodeled their kitchen, took vacations to Italy and Paris, places Samuel and I had only dreamed of visiting while sitting on the porch swing back home. They sent me a thank you card with a photo of the children. Not a word about repayment. Not a word about how I would manage now that I lived on a thin Social Security check. But I told myself it was enough just to see them standing strong. I told myself that love didn't need to be repaid in kind. I had convinced myself of many things back then. Now, as I sat in that sterile room, miles away from the life I once knew, I began to see the truth flickering through like cracks in a wall. My giving had become their expectation. My sacrifices had turned invisible because I had made them seem so effortless. And when Claire's words sliced through the air that morning, it was as if all those hidden sacrifices rose up to demand acknowledgement. I pressed my hands against my face and wept quietly, careful not to let the sound escape beyond my door. The air freshener Claire had placed in the hallway hissed every 15 minutes, puffing out the smell of lavender and chemicals, and each burst reminded me of how she wanted to cover up my existence. That night, at dinner, I tried to smile as David talked about his latest project, and the children scrolled through their phones under the table. Claire passed me the potatoes as though she hadn't wounded me hours earlier. "You look tired, Margaret," she said sweetly, her smile the same one she used on neighbors when she wanted to appear gracious. "Maybe you should rest more. At your age, rest is important. At my age, as if 75 were an illness, as if my years were an inconvenience they had to endure." I nodded silently and lowered my eyes, hiding the storm raging inside me. That night I couldn't close my eyes. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the muffled sounds of laughter drifted down the hallway. The television in the living room buzzed with the rhythm of a family I was no longer a part of. I clutched Samuel's Bible against my chest and tried to breathe through the ache in my ribs. Sleep wouldn't come, only memories. They came in waves, crashing against me so hard that I felt myself drowning in them. I remembered how Samuel and I had once dreamed of traveling when we were older. He used to joke about seeing the ocean from every coast, about tasting food we couldn't pronounce, about walking hand in hand through streets lit by lanterns instead of street lamps. We said we would do it when the children were grown and money was less tight. But life doesn't always wait for the right time. Bills piled up, repairs on the house, medical expenses, and before we knew it, those dreams had been folded away like the quilts in my cedar chest, kept safe but never used. I rolled onto my side and thought of the day Samuel passed. The house had been too quiet that morning. His breath shallow, his hand heavy in mine. I had whispered hymns into his ear, though I wasn't sure he could hear them anymore. When his chest stopped rising, something inside me stilled too. I remember calling David, desperate to hear his voice, desperate for my son to carry a piece of the weight I could no longer hold. The first call went unanswered. The second, the third. When Claire finally picked up, her voice was annoyed, groggy with sleep. "Margaret, it's the middle of the night. Can it wait?" she asked, as though death could be scheduled for a more convenient hour. "No," I whispered, staring at Samuel's still body beside me. "It cannot wait." David came 2 days later. He hugged me quickly, the kind of hug you give when you're late for something else. And then he began listing reasons why I couldn't stay on the farm alone. "Mom, you can't keep this place up by yourself," he said, glancing at the leaky roof, at the creaking steps. "It's dangerous. You'll hurt yourself. You should come live with us. We have space." He spoke with the certainty of a man who had already decided for me. I agreed because grief makes you weak, because the thought of silence in that farmhouse without Samuel felt unbearable. I left behind the only place I had ever truly belonged. I left behind neighbors who had known me since I was a girl, the church where I had sung in the choir for 50 years, the garden Samuel and I had built row by row with our bare hands. Moving into their house was supposed to be a new chapter, but it felt more like being written out of the story. My grandchildren, Ethan and Maya, were polite but distant. Ethan buried himself in his sports and online games. Maya floated between ballet, art lessons, and endless hours on her phone. They didn't mean to be cruel, but their indifference cut deep. I tried to give in little ways. When Ethan mentioned needing new cleats for his soccer team, I slipped money from my small emergency fund into his bag. When Maya said her class was doing a special art project, I bought her paints even though it meant skipping groceries for myself. I told myself it was what grandmothers did, that giving was my language of love. But the more I gave, the more invisible I became. Last month, when Claire hosted her book club, she asked if I might rest in my room so the ladies could have the living room to themselves. I sat for 3 hours alone, hearing laughter and clinking glasses seep through the walls, while the scent of catered appetizers drifted toward me. It was as though I had become a secret they preferred hidden. My life had shrunk to 4 beige walls, a narrow bed, and the faint hum of the washer next door. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that if I tried harder, if I smiled more, if I stayed quiet, eventually they would see me again. But deep inside, I knew something had broken. One afternoon, while tidying the small desk in my room, I stumbled upon papers that made my hands go cold. They must have slipped from the stack David kept. My eyes caught familiar words. Last Will and Testament of Margaret Louise. My breath stopped. It was my will, the one I had updated after Samuel's death. But this copy was marked up with notes in David's handwriting. Numbers scribbled in the margins. Proceeds from farm sale, $285,000. Life insurance, $40,000. Savings, $5,200. Total, $330,200. My heart raced as I read further. On another page, in Claire's looping script, I saw the words, minus what we've already put in her care, still enough inheritance to manage. Beside it was a printout of nursing home costs. Several facilities circled. Notes about Medicare coverage, calculations, plans. They weren't just thinking about my future care. They were mapping out how much my life was worth to them in dollars and cents. I sat there with those papers spread across my lap, the numbers swimming before my eyes, as though the ink itself were poisoned. My stomach churned, and for a moment I thought I might faint right there on the thin carpet Claire had chosen to match her carefully curated design. The betrayal was so sharp it left me breathless. Every act of kindness, every warm smile, every affectionate mom that David had offered suddenly twisted into something else entirely. I could see it now, not as love freely given, but as calculations, as quiet investments toward a day they had already mapped out, a day when my life would be reduced to an inheritance to be split, spent, enjoyed. Claire's voice, which had once seemed merely cold, now rang in my ears with chilling clarity. Her presence makes the house feel heavy. And I realized with a sickening lurch that to her, my existence wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an obstacle on the way to what she believed was hers. That evening, I went through dinner like a ghost. The roast sat heavy on my plate, untouched. I watched my son speak about his firm's latest contracts. His voice full of energy, his hands moving the way Samuel's once had when telling stories about the factory. I wanted so badly to see my boy again, the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees, who clung to my skirts when thunder shook the windows, who whispered that he loved me in the dark after bad dreams. But now, across that glossy dining table, I didn't see my child. I saw a man with eyes that flickered like an abacus, tallying numbers behind every word. When he noticed my silence, he tilted his head, frowning slightly. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, as though the concern were genuine. I looked at him long and hard, searching for the boy I remembered. All I saw was distance. "I'm fine," I murmured, though nothing in me was fine. Later, I returned to my room and locked the door, something I had never done before in this house. I spread the papers across the quilt my mother had stitched when I was a girl. Each line felt like a nail driven into the coffin of trust I had built for decades. Samuel's face in our wedding photograph seemed to watch me from the nightstand, as though he were silently asking why I had allowed myself to be placed here, diminished and dismissed. I pressed the photo against my chest and whispered, "I'm sorry, love. I thought they would care for me the way we cared for them." But my words only echoed back emptily in the quiet. That night I made a decision, though fear twisted my stomach into knots. I would leave. Not in anger, not in loud confrontation, not in tears that would only be dismissed as the weakness of age. I would leave quietly, with dignity, gathering what was left of myself before they could strip it away entirely. The first step was reclaiming what was mine. Important documents, my social security card, my insurance papers, the little bit of savings I still had were locked away in David's cabinet. But I knew where he kept the key. I had noticed years of living with Samuel that men always had a spot, a pocket, a drawer where they believed secrets stayed safe. David was no different. The second step was to ensure that what little I had left could not be siphoned away. I would go to the bank, set new protections, and close access that David had quietly slipped into my accounts when he convinced me it was for convenience. I thought of the hours I had spent sewing gowns for women in town, piecing together scraps into beauty, trading skill for dollars that had fed and clothed my family. Those earnings, those sacrifices, would not become fuel for someone else's greed. But as I laid out my plan, I felt the weight of exhaustion press on me. Could I really start again at 75? Where would I go? Who would welcome me? My siblings were long gone. The friends I once leaned on now either buried or lost to the fog of their own illnesses. Yet the alternative, staying here, living as a ghost, waiting until the day they signed me away into one of those circled facilities, was unthinkable. Better a hard road walked alone than a soft bed built on betrayal. As dawn crept through the thin curtains, I sat by the window watching the first light break across the yard. Claire's roses bloomed neatly along the patio, where my little garden had been exiled behind the garage. I thought of those hidden tomato vines, stubborn and alive, pushing through the soil despite being banished. They reminded me of myself, buried, overlooked, yet still breathing, still fighting toward the light. That was the moment I knew I had not been destroyed. I had been buried alive in silence. But even the buried can rise again. The morning after that decision, I moved through the house as though nothing had changed. I poured Claire her coffee from the machine she adored, even though the smell of its froth made me long for the simple strength of the brew I once made for Samuel. I kissed my grandchildren's foreheads as they hurried off to school, though they barely paused long enough to feel it. I smiled at David as he left for the office, his tie crisp, his briefcase gleaming. The very image of success I had once dreamed for him, but beneath the surface, every step I took carried a new purpose. I was gathering myself piece by piece, weaving together a plan the way I once stitched quilts slowly, carefully, ensuring that each seam would hold when the time came. When the house grew quiet, I went to David's office. My hands trembled as I opened the drawer where he kept his important files. I had seen him reach into it countless times, certain that no one noticed the little brass key taped beneath the desk. Samuel used to say men's hiding places were predictable, and he was right. I slipped the key free and turned the lock. Inside, stacks of documents lay neatly filed: business contracts, receipts, folders labeled in Claire's perfect script. My breath caught when I found the envelope holding my own documents: birth certificate, social security card, life insurance papers, all neatly tucked away, as though my identity had become just another folder in his system. I pressed the envelope to my chest and whispered a prayer of thanks that I had found them before he noticed. I placed everything into my knitting bag, covering it with yarn and needles, knowing Claire would never think to search there. The following day, I made an excuse to walk to the nearby grocery store. My legs ached, but determination pushed me forward. I stopped at the bank, the air inside cool and familiar, though it had been years since I had managed my finances alone. The teller, a kind woman with hair streaked silver, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Johnson, how can I help you today?" she asked, recognizing me from the years when Samuel and I came together, smiling as though we carried the whole world between us. I lowered my voice and told her I needed to change my accounts, to ensure no one but me had access. She glanced at the file, nodded, and began typing. With each keystroke, I felt a thread of my independence being stitched back into place. By the time I left, my small savings meager, as it was, felt like a shield I had reclaimed from the fire. Walking back, I passed children playing in a park, their laughter filling the air. I remembered Ethan and Maya, when they were toddlers, running toward me with arms wide, sticky fingers gripping my cheeks as they kissed me. They had once adored me. But now, when I tried to hand them cookies or ask about their day, they only nodded distractedly, eyes fixed on glowing screens. I wondered if someday they would remember the grandmother who gave and gave, or if I would become just a faint outline in their memory, a woman who once lived in the corner of their house like a shadow. That evening, Claire knocked on my door, her voice sugary sweet. "Margaret, can I talk to you for a moment?" She stepped in, her perfume filling the air, her yoga clothes clinging to her like she was posing for a picture. "It's about Maya's art competition," she began, her tone light. "The entry fees are high, and with everything else going on, well, you know how expensive things are. I was wondering if you could help cover it." I looked at her diamond earrings glittering in the soft light, earrings that cost more than 3 months of my pension. The words slipped from my lips before I could stop them. "How much?" I asked, my voice calm though my heart screamed inside me. She smiled, relieved, and rattled off the number. I nodded, already knowing I wouldn't give it this time. For the first time in years, I let her walk away thinking she had secured my help, while deep inside I whispered, "No more." That night, I baked blueberry muffins, the kind Maya used to love as a child. I set them on the counter, their warm scent filling the kitchen. When she came down in the morning, her face lit up for only a second before her eyes dropped back to her phone. "Thanks, Grandma," she mumbled, grabbing one without looking at me, shoving it into her bag. I stood there, dish towel in hand, aching for her to remember, aching for her to see me not just as the woman who baked or paid bills, but as the grandmother who once rocked her to sleep, who once prayed over her small body when she was feverish. But the moment passed, swallowed by her indifference. In my room later, I opened Samuel's Bible again, running my fingers over verses I had underlined long ago. One in particular seemed to leap from the page. Be the therefore wise as serpents, and harmless as doves. For 75 years I had lived as the dove, giving, forgiving, bending so others could stand tall. But now I realized it was time to learn something of the serpent, to move with quiet wisdom, to protect what was left of me. I folded the papers, hid them in my bag, and whispered a promise to myself. I would not let them write the ending of my story. I would hold the pen in my own hands. The decision to leave sat heavy on my chest, but it also gave me a strange new strength. For months I had felt like a ghost in this house, drifting unnoticed, but now every sound, every glance, every word sharpened into focus. I watched the way Claire's smile brightened only when she needed something. I noticed how David's voice softened when money was involved, and how quickly it hardened when I asked the simplest questions about my own affairs. Even Ethan and Maya, though they did not mean harm, had learned from the silence around them that their grandmother was not a person to be heard, only tolerated. With each day that passed, I collected not only documents and savings but also courage. The kind of courage born from necessity. The same courage that had once pushed me through labor pains, through nights of hunger, through decades of quiet sacrifice. One evening, I sat alone in my room, the muffled hum of the washing machine thrumming through the wall like a heartbeat. I spread out Samuel's photograph, my bank papers, and a small notebook I had started keeping. In it, I wrote names of churches I could reach, shelters for seniors I had heard about through the women at my old congregation. Even the name of an old friend I had not spoken to in years but who once swore her door would always be open to me. My handwriting trembled, but each word was a lifeline. I no longer prayed for my son to see me. I prayed only for strength to see myself clearly. But as determined as I was, fear shadowed me. Where would I go with nothing but a small pension and the clothes in my suitcase? How would I survive alone, at 75, when my hands shook too much to sew for hours, when my knees ached after a short walk? At night, doubt crept in like a thief. Maybe I should stay. Maybe enduring was easier than stepping into the unknown. Yet every time that thought came, Claire's voice returned, sharp and mocking. Her presence makes the house feel heavy. And then the notes on my will, the circled nursing homes. No, I could not stay. Staying would be choosing to die slowly in silence. The final push came unexpectedly. One Saturday, while Claire was hosting friends on the patio, I walked through the kitchen carrying a tray of lemonade. I thought perhaps, just perhaps, I could join them for a moment. As I stepped outside, conversations hushed, eyes darted, and Claire's hand reached for mine, stopping me mid-step. "Oh, Margaret," she said with that sweet smile that burned me now like acid. "Why don't you go rest? We don't want you tiring yourself out." Her friends chuckled lightly. Polite laughter, and I realized then that I was not a guest at this table. I was the embarrassment, the afterthought, the shadow they preferred to keep hidden. I nodded, turned back inside, and placed the tray on the counter with hands that shook not from age but from fury. That was the last time I ever offered myself where I was not wanted. That night, I packed quietly. Just the essentials: clothes folded neatly, Samuel's Bible wrapped in my quilt, the photograph from our wedding day, the envelope of documents I had reclaimed. I tucked them into the suitcase Samuel and I once used for a single trip we managed to take 3 days by the coast, walking barefoot in sand we thought we would see again someday. I touched the handle, remembering his laughter, and whispered, "We'll go somewhere new, love, even if it's just me carrying us now." The next morning, before anyone woke, I slipped into the backyard to tend my hidden garden one last time. The tomatoes were just turning red, small and stubborn, clinging to the vine despite neglect. I picked one and held it in my palm, the skin warm from the rising sun. It was proof that life could bloom in the shadows, unseen yet alive. I placed it gently back among the leaves, whispered a goodbye, and turned toward the house. Inside, the air freshener hissed again, puffing out its artificial lavender into the hallway. But this time, instead of shrinking from it, I let the scent wash over me as a reminder. I was no longer theirs to mask. I was Margaret Louise, 75 years old, a seamstress who had sewn dresses for half the town, a woman who had buried her husband, but not her spirit, a mother who had given beyond measure, and now finally a woman who was ready to take her life back. The morning I chose to leave was quiet, almost deceptively so. The house slept in silence, its walls breathing with the slow rhythm of comfort I no longer felt part of. Claire's shoes lay by the door, perfectly lined up as though even her belongings marched to her orders. David's briefcase sat on the counter, already packed for another week of meetings and deals that consumed his attention. I stood in the hallway with my suitcase beside me, my heart pounding as though I were a girl about to sneak away from home for the first time. Except this time, I wasn't running from rules or curfews. I was walking away from chains of another kind. Chains built from ingratitude, silence, and betrayal. I paused in front of Ethan and Maya's rooms. Their doors were closed, muffling the sound of dreams I no longer shared. I wanted to knock, to whisper goodbye, to remind them that their grandmother loved them more than they could ever understand. But I knew the words would be wasted, at least for now. Love unrecognized can't always be spoken into existence. Instead, I pressed my hand against the wood, let the warmth of the memory of their childhood hugs fill me, and whispered a prayer that someday they would remember the stories I had once told them. The prayers I had whispered over their beds, the way I had always chosen them first. Then I turned and walked away. The suitcase wheels creaked softly on the marble floors as I moved toward the front door. Each step felt heavier, as though the house itself resisted my leaving, trying to keep me bound in its sterile embrace. At the door, I looked back once more. The chandeliers glowed faintly, the walls gleamed with their storm-colored paint, and everything felt as cold and distant as the day I had arrived. No trace of me lingered here, except for the air freshener puffing outside my room, a symbol of the life they had tried to cover up. I reached for the handle, took a deep breath, and stepped into the morning air. The sun greeted me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. The sky stretched wide above me, unfiltered by glass walls or whispered complaints. For the first time in a long while, I felt the freedom of simply breathing air that wasn't measured against someone else's standard. I walked slowly, the suitcase bumping along uneven pavement, each sound a declaration. I am leaving, I am alive, I am not theirs to calculate. I made my way to the bus stop, my legs trembling from the weight of both fear and hope. The bench was cold beneath me, but I welcomed it, because it was mine to sit on. No one to ask permission, no one to make me feel unwelcome. As I waited, a young woman carrying groceries sat beside me. She glanced at my suitcase and then at my face. Traveling? She asked kindly. I smiled faintly, feeling tears sting my eyes. Yes, I whispered. Starting somewhere new. She nodded as if she understood, even though she couldn't possibly know the depth of what those words meant. But in that small exchange, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. The bus arrived with a groan of brakes, its doors opening wide like arms ready to embrace whoever dared to step in. I climbed aboard slowly, clutching the railing for balance, and found a seat by the window. As the city rolled past shops opening their doors, children racing to school, people rushing to jobs, I pressed my hand against the glass and let the world remind me that it was still wide, still full of places and people beyond the cold walls of David's home. I wasn't sure where exactly I was headed. I had a list of churches, a few numbers scribbled in my notebook, and faith that somewhere, somehow, I would find a corner of this world that still wanted me. The bus rumbled forward, carrying me away from the house I had once thought would shelter me in my old age. I thought of Samuel again, his laugh, his steady hands, his voice telling me that sometimes you have to choose yourself even when it hurts. I whispered into the air, I'm choosing us, Samuel. Even if it's just me now, I'm choosing us. The words gave me strength, and for the first time in months, I smiled not because someone expected me to, but because it came from deep within. The bus carried me further than I had been in months, each mile a thread pulling me away from the house where I had been silenced. I watched neighborhoods pass by brick houses with porches where families gathered, small corner stores opening their doors, a park where children were already chasing each other across the grass. Life was moving, breathing, unfolding. And for the first time I felt like I was moving with it instead of being hidden away behind beige walls. Still, my heart beat hard with every stop, wondering if I would recognize where to get off, wondering if I had the courage to step into the unknown without someone guiding me. When the bus pulled into the city center, I knew this was where I needed to begin. I stepped off and the world hit me all at once. Horns blaring, voices rising, the smell of fried food and exhaust mixing in the air. I clutched my suitcase tighter and walked slowly, my knees aching but my resolve unshaken. On the corner, I saw the stone steps of a church, its wooden doors propped open as if in welcome. The sound of a choir rehearsal drifted out, voices rising in harmony. My throat tightened, remembering the decades I had spent singing in my own church choir, my alto voice blending with sisters and friends who had long gone to rest. Drawn by that sound, I climbed the steps and stepped inside. The sanctuary was warm and filled with sunlight, dust motes dancing in the air like tiny blessings. A woman with graying hair tucked under a scarf approached me with a kind smile. "Morning, dear, are you here for the service?" she asked. I hesitated, clutching my suitcase, and whispered, "No. I just needed somewhere to sit." She nodded, her eyes softening. "You can sit here as long as you need. You're safe." The word safe nearly undid me. I sank into a pew, set my suitcase at my feet, and let the choir's song wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt tears fall, not from pain but from relief. After the rehearsal ended, the same woman returned. She introduced herself as Sister Louise and asked gently if I had eaten. When I shook my head, she pressed a sandwich into my hands without question, as though she had been waiting for me all along. I thanked her, though the words felt too small for the flood of gratitude swelling inside me. She asked no intrusive questions, only told me about the church's community meals, and mentioned a small shelter they partnered with nearby. "It's not fancy," she said, "but it's a place to rest, and you won't be alone." That evening, I found myself at the shelter. The building was old, its paint peeling, but the moment I walked in, I felt a kind of warmth that no marble floor could ever provide. Women my age sat at tables playing cards, laughing softly. A man with a cane offered me his seat near the heater, and for the first time in months, I was not an outsider but simply another soul among others. I introduced myself as Margaret, nothing more, nothing less, and that was enough. No one asked about what I could give or what I could pay. They only asked if I wanted tea. Lying in the small cot that night, I clutched Samuel's Bible under the thin blanket and thought about how far I had come in just a single day. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a shadow creeping along someone else's walls. I was here, present, among people who saw me as human, not as a burden or a calculation. My heart ached still for the family I had left behind, but the ache was softened by the possibility of something new, something different. For the first time in a long while, I let myself dream. I dreamed of finding a place of my own, even if it was just a small room with a window where the sun could spill in. I dreamed of sewing again, not for money but for joy. Making dresses for little girls at the shelter, quilts for women who had lost everything. I dreamed of being seen, not for what I could provide, but for who I was. And as the night carried me into sleep, I whispered a prayer that tomorrow would bring me closer to those dreams. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the narrow shelter window woke me earlier than most of the others. I sat up slowly, stretching my stiff legs, and listened to the quiet shuffle of feet in the hallway. For a moment I felt disoriented, not hearing the constant hum of the washing machine, not smelling Claire's expensive candles or the sharp lavender of her air fresheners. Instead, the air smelled faintly of oatmeal and brewed coffee, and though the mattress beneath me was thin, it was mine. No one had told me to stay in my room. No one had asked me to hide. That simple freedom nearly brought me to tears. After breakfast, I offered to help in the kitchen. The shelter workers hesitated at first, not wanting to tire me, but I insisted. I washed dishes while younger women dried them, and soon we were talking as though we had known each other for years. They shared their stories in pieces, some fleeing violence, others abandoned by family, some simply too poor to pay rent. Listening, I realized I was not as alone as I had felt. My pain was my own, but the ache of being unwanted was universal. And in that space, surrounded by strangers, I felt a kinship I hadn't known in months. Later that afternoon, Sister Louise stopped by. She found me sitting by a window with Samuel's Bible in my lap. "You know," she said gently, "we could use someone like you at the sewing circle. We make blankets for families in need. A seamstress's hands are never wasted." I laughed softly, my fingers brushing the faded scars where years of needles had pricked them. I thought maybe these hands were finished. I admitted. "Finished?" "No, child," she said firmly, even though she was younger than me. "These hands still carry purpose. You'll see." That weekend, I joined them, sitting at a long wooden table with fabric piled high. My stitches were slower than they used to be, but with each pull of the needle, I felt something stitching back inside me too. The women laughed, told stories, and asked me questions not about money or favors, but about me, about the dresses I had sewn for weddings, the quilts I had made for my neighbors, the way Samuel used to fall asleep in his chair while I hemmed late into the night. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. My voice mattered. My presence was wanted. Days passed, then weeks. I began teaching some of the younger women how to patch clothes, how to turn scraps into something beautiful. One girl, barely 20, looked at me one evening and said, "Miss Margaret, you make me feel like I can do anything with these hands." Her words lit something in me I thought had died. I realized then that I still had something to give, not money, not inheritance, but knowledge, patience, and love. And this time, it was received with gratitude instead of entitlement. One evening, as I walked back from the church with my small group of new friends, I caught sight of a family eating together at a restaurant, their laughter spilling out onto the street. For a moment, pain stabbed me, thinking of David, Claire, and the grandchildren I had left behind. I wondered if they even noticed my absence. But then, just as quickly, I reminded myself that love built on conditions is no home at all. I had given them everything, and still, they had turned my presence into something to be concealed. Now I was learning that true belonging doesn't demand you shrink to fit it, allows you to expand, to be fully yourself. That night, I lay in bed and whispered to Samuel, "I'm finding my way, love. Slowly, but I'm finding it." The room was quiet, but I could almost hear his laugh, see his proud smile, feel his hand on mine. For the first time in many months, I slept without fear of being erased. I slept with hope. Weeks turned into months, and I began to realize that leaving my son's house was not the end of my story but the beginning of a chapter I never thought I would have the courage to write. Life at the shelter was far from easy. There were nights when the thin mattress ached against my back, mornings when I wondered how long I could manage on so little money, and moments when I longed so deeply for the sound of my grandchildren's laughter that it hurt to breathe. But alongside those hardships came something precious: dignity. I was no longer someone's hidden burden, no longer a calculation scribbled in the margins of a will. I was Margaret, a woman with 75 years of living, carved into her skin and spirit, and I mattered again. The sewing circle grew into more than a pastime. It became my ministry, my way of turning broken pieces into something whole. I stitched blankets for children who had lost their homes, taught young women how to mend their own clothes so they could walk into job interviews with confidence, and even pieced together a quilt from scraps donated by the community. That quilt hung in the church hall, and whenever I saw it, I felt Samuel's presence as if he were standing beside me, nodding with pride. "See," I would whisper under my breath, "we are still building something together." One afternoon, Sister Louise asked me to speak to a group of volunteers who wanted to understand the needs of the elderly in our city. I hesitated at first, my voice trembling when I began. But as I told my story of sacrifice, of invisibility, of choosing to walk away, saw their eyes fill with tears. When I finished, they stood and applauded, not for the pain I had endured but for the strength I had found. In that moment, I realized my story was not just mine. It belonged to every elder who had ever been silenced, every parent who had ever given until there was nothing left, every soul who had ever felt hidden away. Do I still ache for David? Of course, he is my son, flesh of my flesh, and a part of me will always love him. But I also know now that love cannot be forced, nor should it be given at the cost of your own worth. Perhaps one day he will look for me. Perhaps Ethan and Maya will ask why their grandmother left. If that day comes, I hope they will be ready to hear the truth that I left not because I stopped loving them, but because I finally remembered to love myself too. As I sit here now, telling you this story, I want you to understand something. Our value does not expire with age. We are not burdens to be hidden, nor shadows to be erased. We are living testaments to resilience, wisdom, and love that endures even when unappreciated. If you are listening to me and you have ever felt invisible, I want you to know you are not alone. Your story matters, your presence matters, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to walk away from a place where you are diminished, and walk toward the unknown where dignity waits. So, my dear friends, if this story touched your heart, I invite you to join me here, in this little corner, where stories remind us that we are still alive, still important, still needed. Please subscribe to this channel, not just to hear my voice, but to stand together in a community where no one is left unseen. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell us what you've endured, what you've overcome, what you've learned. Let us lift each other up, remind each other that age cannot erase our worth, and teach the world that even in our quiet years, we carry strength beyond measure. And if this video gave you something to think about, let us know what stayed with you, what you will carry into your own life. Together, we can turn silence into song, invisibility into presence, and broken pieces into something whole again.